I'm going to show you how you can set up an isolated virtual lab within Hyper-V on Windows 11 or Windows 10. The lab is going to have a pfSense gateway acting as a router/firewall combo so that we can give the lab full access to the internet, but isolate it from the network that the host machine is connected to, enabling us to set up and test the likes of Active Directory domains, DHCP servers, without it broadcasting any of these test services to the entire network that the host computer is connected to. So to set up this isolated environment, we will need a couple of things. We will need, obviously, Hyper-V to be installed. If you need to enable Hyper-V on your workstation, you can open up a terminal and type optional features, all one word. And then in the optional features panel, you can just tick the Hyper-V services and just make sure all 4 services are enabled, and then press OK, and then that will go ahead and install it for you. And the only thing you need to do is reboot after that, and then you'll be able to open up the Hyper-V Manager. Now that you've got the Hyper-V Manager installed, we can then go ahead and download pfSense. If you're familiar with other virtual routers and firewall appliances, you can by all means use that, but in this guide we're just going to focus on pfSense. So you'll just need to download version 2.6 or whatever the latest version is. I'll put a link to this in the blog post that is linked in the video description. As well as for the Windows environment, we are just going to be using the evaluation version of Windows Server 2022. So if you come to the Evaluation Center on the Microsoft website, you can then download Windows Server 2022, but I'll also link to that in the blog post that is linked in the description. So now we've got our pfSense downloaded, we can come back to our Hyper-V Manager. And then the first thing we'll need to do is come to the Virtual Switch Manager. And then in here, we need to create 2 switches. So if we select New Virtual Network Switch, select External, and then Create Virtual Switch. And then we can just give it a name. For this, I will call it Lab Switch 1, because this will be our switch that connects it to the main network, granting it internet access. And then select External Network, and then select the network adapter that is connected to your local network, in this case the Ethernet controller, and then we can press apply and then yes. Once those settings are applied, we can do new virtual switch again, select private because we want to create a private switch that can only be accessed by virtual machines that run on this physical computer. So if we create a new private switch and call this lab switch LAN. So this will be the LAN switch that all of the virtual machines in our lab connect to. And then we'll select private network and then apply and then OK. So we've got both of our switches set up how we want them. So the next thing to do is actually create some virtual machines. So if we come to new and then virtual machine and then next, and then we'll give this one a name. So the first one we want to create is our firewall or our router. So I'll just call this FW01 and then next. As pfSense is built on Linux, we need to select generation 1 and then do next. And then for the startup memory, we can give it 1 gig. That will be more than sufficient in a lab environment. And then untick the dynamic memory and then next. Now, what we'll need to do is give this our WAN switch that we created, which is connected to the external network. So we've selected the lab switch 1 and then next. For the disk size, we'll just give it 20 gig because it doesn't really need a right lot. And then next, and then install an operating system from a bootable CD/DVD. And then we'll select an ISO file and we'll select the pfSense ISO that we downloaded. And then next, and then finish. Once we've done that, we can right click and come to settings. For the processors, we'll just want to drop this down to 1. And then for the checkpoints, we'll just untick use automatic checkpoints and then press OK. So now if we double click, we can turn our pfSense on and it should boot automatically into the install media. And then it will start to go through the install process. In the install process, we can press enter to accept the license agreement, and then press OK to install pfSense. If you scroll down, select the keyboard language that you want. Then press enter, and then press up, and then continue with the key map that you've selected. We've got a couple of different options. We've got auto BIOS, or UEFI. What we'll do is we'll just select the auto ZFS method, and then enter again to install. It'll ask you if you want to set up any redundancy for the ZFS RAID type. We'll just leave this as Stripe because we don't actually need any redundancy, and it's on a virtual drive anyway. So we'll press enter, press spacebar to select our virtual disk, and then press enter again. It'll tell us that it'll format the drive and it'll destroy any data that's on it, but just a virtual drive, so we'll select yes, and then enter. And then it will go through and automatically go through the install process, and it should only take a few seconds. Now that that's finished, it'll ask us if we want to do any final manual modifications. We'll just press no, and then reboot. Now that's rebooting, if we come to the settings of the virtual machine, and then come to the DVD drive, we can just select none on our image, just to unmount that ISO. And then if we come back, and then we'll just hit reset. This should then start to boot from the local drive, and then it'll continue with the installation process. Now that that's booted, it's asking us if we want to set up VLANs. We can just press N for no, because we don't want any VLANs. And then it will ask us what interface we want to use. We've currently only got one interface, which is HN0. So if we type HN0 and then press enter, we currently don't have a LAN address, so we'll just press enter, because that will skip it. It'll say the interface will be assigned as followed, and it'll give the WAN address HN0. Press Y to proceed. It'll then go through the configuration process and automatically configure it. Now that that's finished configuring our WAN interface, which will be used for the internet, it should get a DHCP address of whatever is on your local network. So for my local home network, it's just 192.168.1 and a 24-bit address, and it's given us 173, which has just been got from my local DHCP server. Now if we come out of it, what we need to do is set up the LAN side of this. So if we shut down our pfSense appliance, and then wait for that to shut down. Now that that's shut down, if we right click and come to settings, and then add hardware, we can add a new network adapter. And then for our second network adapter, we can configure it on the virtual switch, which is our LAN, so lab switch LAN. And then we can apply an OK. So now this has got two network adapters attached to it, the WAN for access to the internet, and then the LAN for access to the local network within the virtual lab environment. So if we OK this, and then turn our pfSense back on. Now that that's booted, we need to come into option 1, which is assign interfaces. So if we press 1, it'll show us we've got HN0 interface, which is our WAN interface, which is up, and our HN1, which is down. So the HN1 is what we're going to set up for our LAN interface. So if we do N to not set up VLANs, it will ask us to enter the WAN interface name, which we want HN0, and then press enter. And then it will ask us to set up the LAN interface name, which is HN1. So it'll say the interfaces will be assigned as followed: WAN HN0 and LAN HN1. So if we do Y to proceed, once that's finished reloading our config, we can see we've now got our two adapters. And then if we come into option 2, which is set interfaces IP address, we can select option 2 to configure our LAN interface. And then first we can give it an IP address, which in this case I'm going to give my gateway an IP address of 10.0.0.254. You can give it whatever range you want. I'm giving mine on a 10.0.0.0/24 range. So if we do 10.0.0.254, it'll ask us for the subnet mask in a bit count. So I'm going to give mine a 24-bit subnet and press enter. As this is a LAN, we don't need to give it any gateway address. So we can just press enter. We don't need an IPv6 address, so we can just press enter again. And then now it'll ask us if we want to set up a DHCP server on the LAN. If you want, you can press Y and go through the config to set up a DHCP server on the pfSense. However, I'm going to press no because I'm going to install a Windows Server domain and I want to use the DHCP server that is within Windows Server. So I'm going to select N and press enter because I'm not going to set up a DHCP server. It'll ask us if we want to revert the web configurator protocol to HTTP. We can just press Y on that. That'll just enable us to be able to access the web configurator interface via a browser on 10.0.0.24, which is the IP address of the LAN. So if we do Y and then enter, that'll apply that config. Now if we press enter again, it should reload it. And then now we can see we've got our two interfaces. WAN, which is going to connect and pass all our traffic to the internet, and then LAN, which will connect all of our local lab machines. So that's all we have to do in the pfSense. So if we just close out of our terminal, we've now got our firewall, which is running, and then now we can get on with creating our Windows servers. So if we again come to new and then virtual machine, and then come through the wizard, the first one I'm going to create is DC01. For my Windows lab. So if we do next, select a Gen 2 because it's a Windows server and it's 64-bit UEFI. I'm going to give it 4 GB of RAM, unselect dynamic memory. Now this is the important part. For the configure networking, every virtual machine that you want to be within this lab, you need to select the lab switch LAN, not the WAN. So the WAN will give it access to the network that the host machine is connected to, but we don't want that. We want everything isolated on our LAN switch, which can only be accessed within the Hyper-V environment. And then all of the internet traffic will then get passed to this firewall appliance, which will then go over the WAN switch to the network. But all of the virtual machines that you create need to be on the lab switch LAN. And then press next. We'll give it a 60 gig hard drive. And then next, select an ISO, and I'm going to select my 2022 evaluation, and then next, and then finish, and this will create us our virtual machine. And then if we come in and go to settings, we can drop this down to 2 cores, and then for checkpoints, uncheck automatic checkpoints, apply, OK. And then if we open it and turn it on, we should be able to boot from our ISO and then get installing our Windows Server 2022. I'm just going to quickly run through this. So next, install, select data center, desktop experience, next, take the license, next, custom install, and then select our 60 gig partition, and then next, and then that'll go through and install our operating system. Now that that's rebooted after installing, we can enter a password for our administrator account on the server and then press finish. And then we can just make this full screen, save settings, and then connect. And then we can just log into our Windows server. So now we've got our Windows server. We can come to our local server, and there are just a couple of things we need to do. The first being give the domain controller a static IP. So if we come to properties, IPv4, and then give it a static address of 10.0.0.1, and then the same subnet mask that we use for our pfSense gateway, and then the IP address of our pfSense gateway. And then for the DNS servers, I will just use a public DNS server, because once it's promoted to a domain controller, it's going to then look at itself with these public addresses as the forwarders. So we will do that for now, and then OK. We will correct the time zone. And then for this demo, I'll just turn off the IE enhanced security. So now if we open up Edge, let's just double check. We should have internet access through our pfSense gateway. Looks like we do. So if we try and come to Google, that works. If we come to my website loads, our Microsoft loads. So there we go, we've got internet access in our lab. So if we close this now, we can just give this a rename, DC01. Give it a reboot. And then log back in when it's rebooted. And then it should open up Server Manager, and then we can actually go ahead and promote to a domain controller by coming to Manage, Add Roles and Features. I'll just quickly go through this wizard, as I do have a full guide on setting up an Active Directory domain, which I'll link. So we will just select Active Directory Domain Services, DNS server, and we'll also want this to be a DHCP server. And I think that is all for now, so we'll just next, group policies ticked, and then next through the rest of this wizard, and then install. Now that that's installed, we can close the wizard, come up to the little flag, and then promote the server to a domain controller. We'll do a new forest, and then I'd recommend using a subdomain on a fully qualified domain name that you own, as mine's dannymoran.com. We'll use AD, or you can use internal, or whatever you want. I'll use AD, and then next. For the domain controller options, we'll leave the forest and domain functional levels as the latest, which is 2016. DNS and global catalog ticked. We can't tick read-only because it's the first domain in the forest. Set a DSRM password, and then next. And then next on the DNS options. We can leave NetBIOS as the default. The same with the paths, we'll just leave these to install in the default C Windows directory. And then next. Verify what we've selected, and then next. Once it's verified the prerequisites, we can then just press install. That looks good to me. We'll press install. This will automatically reboot during this process, so we will be back in a second. Now that our newly promoted domain controller has booted after being promoted, we can log in using the domain we created and the administrator account, and then the password we initially set, and then it should log us in. And then the last thing we'll need to do is within Server Manager, we'll just check that it converted our DNS server to its local, to the local host address, which it has. And then we can also load up DNS and make sure that if we right click the server and then go to forwarders, we've got our two forwarders to our public DNS, and they are indeed resolving. So the last thing we'll need to do to finish setting up our lab is come to complete the DHCP configuration. We'll come next and then commit using the domain administrator. And then if we open up the DHCP management console, come to IPv4 and then right click and do new scope, we can create a LAN for our lab network. We'll give it an IP address range of 10.0.0.1 to 10.0.0.254 with a 24-bit subnet mask. So this scope will have the entire 24-bit range, and then if we do next, we can add an exclusion to exclude the first 100 addresses, and then we'll also do an exclusion to exclude the last 54 addresses. So if we add them exclusions, it'll only give out between 101 and 199. So then we can do next, leave it for 8 days, but so actually you can drop that down to 1 as it's only a lab, doesn't really matter. Configure additional scope options. And then here for our router, our default gateway, we'll want to give this the IP address of that pfSense router we set up before. So in my case it was 10.0.0.254. We can press add. And then for the DNS server, it should automatically populate your domain controller. We can leave that as it is and do next. Win server, we can leave that blank and press next. And then we can activate the scope. Finish. And then if we give it a couple of seconds and then refresh, server's gone green. We've got our mainland scope with our pool. Currently no leases, which is fine. And then that is it for setting up the initial lab. So all we need to do now is if we close our domain controller, we've got our firewall and our domain controller. The next thing we need to do is start creating clients, whether that's Windows 11 or Windows Server clients. The only thing you need to do is come to New Virtual Machine, give it a name, so I'll just call this Server 2022, and then Next, Generation 2, give it 4 GB of RAM, untick dynamic memory. Now this is the only important thing. Whenever you're creating the lab virtual machines, always give it this LAN, not the WAN switch. So we give it LAN, and then Next, and then we'll just come through the rest of this wizard, select our server evaluation that we want to install, and then Finish. And then I'll just come into the settings and then drop it down to two processors, and then untick use automatic checkpoints. And then now we can just boot into it and then install Windows Server or whatever client we are wanting to use, whether that's Windows or Linux or whatever. So I'll just quickly run through this again. Install. Desktop experience, next. Agree to the license. Select our drive, and then next to start the install. Now that's finished, we can set our local administrator password. Finalize the settings. Full screen. And we can see it's automatically connected us to our lab domain controller. If we open up a command prompt, we should be able to reach the internet, which we can. If we do an ipconfig/all, we can see that it's got our domain controller suffix. DHCP server is the server we've just set up. It's got the correct gateway, which is our pfSense firewall. The DNS server is our domain controller. And we can also reach our local domain, ready to add servers to the domain and get on with testing in our lab environment. So that's how, using Hyper-V, a pfSense firewall and a domain controller, we can set up our lab template, and then we can just keep creating other clients, whether that's servers or workstations, that can be used for testing in our Windows lab.